So that authenticity is not a luxury. It's also built-in need. But what happens to a small child where, let's say they have experienced anger because they're 2 years old and they're frustrated, so they're angry, but mom and dad, oh, angry? Get away from us. Time out. Now the child's brain has a decision to make. I can be authentic and experience my anger and lose my attachment relationship, or I can fit into the attachment relationship by suppressing part of who I am, give up my authenticity. Now in every case, the child is not a choice. The attachment is absolute. So the child will be pushed down parts of themselves, their authenticity. They lose contact with themselves. The essence of trauma is loss of contact with yourself. Then we spend all our lives. So now as an adult, we still have a fear of authenticity because if we're authentic, we might lose our attachments. The difference is that you and I and our listeners as adults are no longer children. It's no longer such a tragic dilemma. So if I call you up for coffee and you say no, I might say, I don't want to talk to Doug ever again. But you can survive, can't you? You don't need that attachment relationship with me anymore. You need your authenticity much more than you need me. But if you're still running along the program that you developed as a child, you will suppress yourself. Oh, if I say no, Gabor won't like me. And so you suppress your own authentic impulse in order to be accepted and attached to with me. A lot of people face that problem. And all I can say is, it's a painful one. Because if you're going to be authentic, you might lose some relationships. But the question is, who would you rather have? An authentic relationship with yourself or an inauthentic relationship with others?
What if I told you that the biggest challenges you face, your stress, your pain, your addictions, aren't the real enemy, but a message from your body, mind, and soul? A message urging you to reconnect with your authentic self? But here's the shocking truth. Unless you confront what's been buried deep inside, those wounds you didn't even know you carried, your path to freedom might remain just out of reach. And the cost? Your health, your happiness, and your most precious relationships. Yet there's hope. Imagine discovering that the parts of yourself you thought were lost, your joy, your strength, your purpose, are still within you, waiting to be reclaimed. The journey isn't easy, but every step forward leads you closer to becoming whole again. Let's dive in and watch together as Dr. GaborMate uncover the mind-body connection in chronic illness.
Addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary relief or pleasure in and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences and has difficulty giving up despite the negative consequence. So that's what an addiction is. Okay? Now, so craving pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice that in my definition I said nothing about drugs. I said any behavior. So it could be drugs, of course, cocaine, crystal meth, opiates, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine. Could also be sex, gambling, pornography, shopping, eating, work, internet, gaming, just about anything. And the question I always ask people, and I'm going to ask you this now. So you've had your addictions. I don't know your personal history, but I don't need to know what it was. What I'm going to ask you is this, not what you're addicted to, but what did it give you in the short term that you wanted? What did you crave about it? The addiction wasn't your primary problem. It wasn't the disease. The addiction was your attempt to solve the problem of emotional pain, the problem of lack of peace, the lack of security. Then, if we ask, well, what is the source of the pain? What is the lack of security all about? Why don't you have peace of mind? We get to trauma. So, the fundamental cause of all addictions, and I don't care what they are too, is always trauma that results in us having emotional pain, distress, lack of peace. So, my mantra around addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And to understand people's pain, you have to look into their life histories. Not this idea of that you got this genetic disease, which is complete nonsense, it's scientific nonsense. Not this idea that you made some bad choices, because I never met a single person in my medical career, or since or before, who ever chose to be an addict. The question is, why were you in pain? What did you need to run away from? And that answer is always just rooted in trauma. First of all, what is trauma? So the actual meaning of the word trauma is a wound. That's the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a physical or a psychological wounding. So what causes that wounding? Well, what causes that wounding is either when bad things happen that shouldn't have happened, such as happened to a lot of people, says sexual abuse in childhood, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, an emotionally very unsafe family environment in the midst of a divorce or family conflict, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being jailed, a parent dying, neglect. These are very wounding experiences for young children. Very wounding.
4,000 kids in North Dakota were suspected victims of abuse and neglect. That's according to the most recent data from the Department of Human Services. That's from 2019.
Children can be wounded by being hurt in the ways that I talked about, but they can also be wounded if their essential needs for human development are not met. A lot of families where there's no overt trauma as such, children are still wounded because they're not seen for who they are, not accepted for who they are, not valued for who they are, when there's pressures on them to be different other than the way they are. That can also wound children. Now, what are the impacts of that? Well, if you understand about the human, look, here's the thing. You can take an acorn, and you can say that it's the nature of the acorn to become a mighty oak tree, which it is. But is that going to happen automatically? If I put that acorn on my desk, will it ever become an oak tree? Never. Because for healthy development of that acorn, certain conditions need to be met. The same thing is true for human development. So for the brain to develop properly, you need the right environment. Now, the human brain develops, I'm quoting a scientific article from Harvard now, the human brain develops from conception into adulthood. So brain development begins in the womb, continues into adulthood, and it needs the right conditions. Just like the oak tree needs the right conditions for it to reach its stature. The essential condition for healthy brain development is a non-stressed environment, beginning in the womb. So you can stress pregnant animals in a laboratory or pregnant women in real life, and their offspring will be more likely to be addicted later on in life, because that stress interferes with healthy brain development. I'm talking about still in the womb, and then throughout childhood. So what people don't appreciate, that this is just modern brain science, is that the circuits in the brain, including the circuits that get involved in addiction, which I can talk about, I won't name them now, but the circuits that get involved in addiction, for them to develop properly, they need an attuned, non-stressed relationship with emotionally present, non-depressed parents. So when this trauma happens and their parents are not able to provide those conditions, those brains don't develop the way they should. In fact, they develop in ways that predispose them to addiction. I'll give you one quick example. Doug, I don't know your personal say, were you ever addicted to opiates at all? Opiates work in the human brain because we have receptors for them. In other words, on the surface of a brain cells, like imagine my head is a brain cell, then here's a receptor. A receptor is a molecule where a messenger can fit. So if I have a receptor that looks like this, but there's a messenger chemical that looks like this, there's no fit. If the messenger chemical looks like this, now there's a fit. So we have receptors for opiate molecules on our brain cells. Why do we have receptors for opiate molecules? I mean, opiates come from opium in Afghanistan. Why would I have a receptor for an opiate plant in Afghanistan? I don't. I have receptors for my brain's natural opiates. So we have natural opiates in our bodies. They're called endorphins. Endorphin means endogenous or internal opiate-like substance, morphine-like substance. Why do we have natural receptors for opiates? Is because we have opiate system in our bodies. We manufacture our own opiates. If we understand why you're addicted to fentanyl or to OxyContin, an opiate, we have to understand what does the natural opiate do in the human brain. You know what they do? Three things. One is they relieve pain. We already talked about that. They relieve physical and emotional pain. That's why we have endorphins, internal opiates. That's the first thing they do, pain relief. The second thing they do is give us the experience of pleasure and reward, elation, joy. Well, try living life without that. And the third thing they do is the most important. They make possible a little thing called love. Love is the connection between parent and child, the attachment relationship. Without endorphins, that doesn't happen. So endorphins are the love chemical. So when people do endorphins, it's because they have too much pain. I'm sorry, not they do endorphins. When people do opiates, it's because they have too much pain in their lives. They need soothing of the pain. They're lacking pleasure and reward and joy. And they're looking for the warmth of love. And that's why a heroin addicted patient of mine once told me, Doc, when I do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug. So in other words, when you tell me that you're an opiate addict, you're telling me that early in your childhood, you didn't have the love you needed, you sustained too much pain, and you lacked pleasure and joy. And when you did that opiate chemical for the first time, you felt like a normal human being for the first time. That's what you just told me. That's my understanding. In my book on addiction, which is entitled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I have an appendix on the prevention of drug addiction. And the prevention of addiction is not telling kids that drugs are bad. The reason is because the kids that listen to adults are not at risk, and the kids who are at risk don't listen to adults. So the prevention has to actually begin in the womb. So we got to start with pregnant women, because already these circuits are being potentiated in the womb. So you have to start with pregnant women and say, what are the stresses in your life? What's your relationship like? How much support are you getting? Because you want to create a peaceful environment in the womb for that infant already. The second thing I say to parents is work on your own issues. Because any traumas that you haven't worked out in yourself, almost inevitably, you're going to pass it on to your kids, like I did. You know, these things that I'm talking about now, I didn't know them when I was a young parent. And there was significant traumas that my wife had, that I had, that we haven't even realized yet. So that it's almost inevitable that parents who are not conscious will pass on their traumas to their kids. So work on your own issues. Really important. Number 3, children have certain needs. In my new book, The Myth of Normal, I have a chapter on the irreducible needs of children. Those needs include unconditional loving acceptance, the capacity to experience all their emotions, whether they're anger or joy or pain. Those emotions need to be received. In other words, the question you have to start off with as a parent is, what are the needs that my children have for healthy development? Both in this book, The Myth of Normal, and in a previous parenting book I wrote called Hold On to Your Kids, you have to start off not with what do we want our kids to be or how do we want them to behave, but what are their needs for healthy development? And in this modern society, parents are really challenged to meet those needs. Let's imagine you're an adult in a relationship. And what if your partner said to you, every time you feel anger, I'm going to make you go to your room and sit by yourself? How would that feel to you as an adult? You know? Now, as a child, you're completely dependent on the parent. And in fact, you have this absolute need to belong to the parent and to be close to them, to be attached to them. When we say to a child, if you're angry, you have to separate from me, what you're saying to the child is, if you have a genuine feeling like anger, you can't have the relationship with me. I'm going to deprive you of what you need. In other words, we create a fear-based relationship with the child. No child develops properly under conditions of fear. And there's some very famous psychologists who counsel parents to separate. This whole idea of timeout is a toxic practice. If the punitive timeout, actually when a child is really upset, you know what they need? They need time in. They need to be held in. Oh, you're really angry, aren't you? Yes, I am. You must be really upset. Yeah. They need to be heard and held. Now, I'm not saying we put up with kids hitting their siblings. I'm not talking about permissive parenting. I'm talking about parenting that's attuned to the child. And so the more connection you have with the child, by the way, the more the child will want to do what you want them to do. But essentially, I'm talking about parenting where there's nothing the child can do to threaten the relationship. And every time I punish a child, a 2-year-old doesn't know why. They doesn't know why they're doing what they're doing. They're just doing what they're doing. They don't know intentional. There's no intentional circuits up there yet. So when we punish them, they don't know why we're punishing them. All we know is that they're not acceptable to us. So it's when the child is most upset that they most need you. And my general sense is that illnesses and symptoms come along as the body's way of saying no, because you're not, to saying no to a stressful situation, to a relationship which isn't working, to a job is not good for you. So in a new book, I talk about before the body says no, just check in with yourself regularly. What am I not saying no to? What am I taking on that I don't really want to? And why don't I say no? Like a simple thing. I'm in Baltimore and I call you up and, hey, do you want to go for coffee? But you're tired. You haven't slept all night. You don't want to go for coffee. But you say yes because you don't know how to say no because you're afraid that I won't like you or that you owe it to me or something. So you say yes. Well, if you chronically do that, what's the impact on you? The impact is you're always going to be tired and you're going to be resentful. And so I ask people, ask themselves, why am I not saying no? But there's a no that wants to be said, but you're not saying it. And what's the belief that has you not saying no? So if I ask you to go out for coffee, even though you don't feel like it, you don't even like coffee, you're tired, you have other things to do, but you say, yes, I will. There's a story behind that. The story behind it, it's my responsibility to feel Gabor feel good. In other words, you're taking responsibility for my emotional states. Well, that's the story. Where did you learn that? Oh, I learned that when I was a kid, when I was made to take responsibility for how my parents felt. So there's some very simple ways. The key dynamic for me are people being authentic. Are they being true to themselves? The less true we are to ourselves, the more sick we get. And I know people with multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, and I talk about this in the book, who when they get a flare-up, instead of panicking and running to the doctor, they say, oh, what is this trying to tell me right now? And they actually use the disease as their teacher of how was I not being authentic? They may or may not take medication. I'm not, of course, as a physician, I'm not against medications. But in addition to that, they do an inventory. How was I not being authentic? What stresses did I take on? And they find that the more they understand that, the milder their illness becomes. Because once they learn how to say no, the body doesn't have to. As human beings, we need contact and connection. That's our nature. The capitalist myth that we're individualistic, aggressive, competitive, selfish creatures is got nothing to do with reality. How we evolved over millions of years, whereas collaborative communal creatures. And so we have a need for attachment. And quite apart from that, the young child and the infant cannot even live in the absence of attachment. I mean, no child, no bear cub, no puppy dog, no kitten, no baby penguin can survive without attachment relationship with adults. Because we need them to nourish us, to protect us, to keep us warm, and so on. So in childhood, the need for attachment is absolutely non-negotiable. But as you imply, we also have the need to be ourselves. Now, the need to be ourselves is also a survival need, by the way, because what does it mean to be ourselves, to be authentic? It means to be in touch with our feelings and to be able to act on them. Now, out there in nature, where we evolved for millions of years, how long do you survive if you're not in touch with your gut feelings?
Generational trauma often hides in plain sight, woven into the fabric of family traditions, behaviors, and unspoken rules. What makes it so insidious is how it disguises itself as normal, a quiet shadow that dictates how we view ourselves and the world. This isn't just about inherited pain. It's about how those experiences shape coping mechanisms and survival strategies that, while useful for one generation, can become burdensome for the next. The real challenge lies in recognizing the invisible threads tying us to the past. Awareness is the first step, but true healing demands courage. Courage to question, to confront, and to unlearn. It's about honoring the struggles of those who came before while giving yourself permission to build a different story. The beauty of generational healing is that when one person begins the process, the ripple effects are felt backward to honor past pain and forward to free future generations. Stay tuned and continue to watch, because this is the important part, the path to healing, wholeness, and spiritual integration.
And basically, the good news is that the more authentic you become, the more you'll find relationships that can respect that authenticity. So you're not going to be left all alone. But it can be painful at times in this society where we're all expected to be other than who we are. Part of the problem is the language that we use. So I grew up in communist Hungary, by the way, as a kid, and there used to be a joke in Eastern Europe which said that you could be honest and intelligent or a member of the Communist Party. In fact, you could be all two of those things, but you couldn't be all three at the same time. If you're honest and intelligent, you couldn't be a party member. You could be honest and be a party member, but then you wouldn't be very intelligent, and so on. I related the same way to God. So I was told that God was omniscient, omnipotent, and all good. Now, my grandparents died in Auschwitz, and so did I myself, almost. And I said to myself, what kind of a God could be all good and all powerful and allow Auschwitz to happen? Well, then God couldn't know everything, could he? Or he could know everything and be all powerful, but then he couldn't be any good. Otherwise, he wouldn't allow these horrors to be perpetrated. So the very idea of God I was hostile to, the way God was presented to me. So part of the problem is the language that we use. I used to be very angry at the idea of God. But the question is, why was I angry? Because I so badly wanted to believe in something greater than myself. And the kind of God they gave me, I couldn't believe in that God. It took me a long time to get past that and to realize I still don't have a concept of God as some kind of an entity that's personalized and sitting up there making decisions. That just makes no sense to me. But boy, is it not the case that we're all part of something much greater than we are? That our little egos are just like small manifestations of what's potentially available to us? Isn't it the case that this universe is completely unitary and we happen to be temporary manifestations of universal dynamics that shows up in this particular form that I inhabit and the particular form that you inhabit, but that's not the be-all and the end-all of existence. Human beings have a need for that larger connection, for that. So actually we're spiritual creatures in that sense. I'm not talking of religion here. I mean, sometimes people find spirituality through their religion. Sometimes religion is a real barrier towards spirituality, in the sense of a larger connection, sense of belonging, something greater. When we talk about love, I'm not just talking about sexual love or even personal love. When do we feel more fulfilled? When our hearts are open or when they're closed? There's certain things about our nature that call for this spirituality of some kind. How you get there, through your religion or through nature or through meditation or through yoga or contemplation or whatever the path happens to be, that's an individual choice. But the sense of belonging to something greater, that's a commonality that we share with all existence. I think that's an essential part of who we are. So when I talk about spirituality, that's what I talk about. And in the 12-step proofs, when I talk about God, some people can accept that, but some people it's a real barrier because they grew up in homes where they were beaten over the head in the name of God, So I wish the language can be unfortunate sometimes, but behind that language, the sense of a higher power that we're all a part of, the older I get, the more I recognize the reality of that. Well, really happy to show you. Actually, I got this yesterday, first, just off the press, the myth of normal trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture. We live in a toxic culture. So that if you imagine a laboratory petri dish in which you're growing organisms in a brew, we call that culturing, a culture broth, by the way. That's the technical term. If a large number of organisms in that brew were dying off or getting sick, You'd call that a toxic culture. So, well, on the one hand, we're making advances in treatment. The social conditions keep hurting people really badly. My contention is that live in a culture so out of sync with human needs, and which is so traumatizing to so many people on so many different levels, and it's so stressful for people that diseases and addictions and mental health conditions are burgeoning. By the way, if you look at the numbers of the people dying of overdoses, or the number of kids who are trying to kill themselves, or the number of people being diagnosed with depression and anxiety, the number of women being diagnosed with autoimmune disease, these numbers keep going up and up and up. If you see them as just individual pathology based on genetics, we have no explanation, because genes don't change in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. So if these numbers are going up, it's because there's something going on in the environment. What's going on in the environment is our culture is getting increasingly stressful. So it doesn't matter what advances you're making in treatment, as long as the conditions that brew illness, physical and mental, and addictions are continuing to worsen, you're going to get more and more people getting sick. And that's what's going on. But in addition to that, I have to say that specifically when it comes to addiction, or more broadly speaking, medical illnesses in general, our advances are technical, but they're not advances in wisdom. So that most physicians still don't understand trauma. In fact, most physicians don't even get a single lecture on trauma in their training, which is unbelievable. And many addiction programs are still not trauma informed. They're focused towards getting rid of the behavior, which itself is a useful goal. But unless you deal with the underlying dynamics that drive the behavior, you can expect relapse in large numbers. So we live in a society that's not trauma informed. We have a legal system, an educational system, a medical system that's ignorant about trauma. And we have social conditions that breed trauma on every level. That's why things are getting worse. First of all, you said when people get sober, I make a distinction between abstinence and sobriety. People become abstinent, but that doesn't mean they become sober. Like, abstinence is good. It means you're not using something to temporarily escape from yourself. That's good. You're not getting drunk. You're not getting stoned. That's good. But that's not the same as sobriety. Sobriety is a real capacity of conscious presence. So you can become abstinent without being consciously present. That's the first point. The second point is, as you and I have been agreeing in this conversation, the addictions are always a form of coping, of escape. As you just said, when all of a sudden you stop using the addiction, it doesn't mean that all the problems you've been trying to escape have gone away. You've just taken away a powerful coping mechanism for a good reason, because that same coping mechanism was creating more problems for you. That's true. But all that pain, all that turmoil, that lack of inner peace that you're experiencing before you become addicted, are still going to be there. In fact, because you're abstinent now, you're going to really feel them in a way that maybe you've never been felt before. So now you have to work your way through that to the traumatic source. So it's actually with abstinence that the work actually begins towards sobriety, towards conscious awareness. So that's the journey. Now, recovery, interesting word. I used to be for a few years an English teacher, so I pay a lot of attention to language. So what does it mean to recover something?
Get back, right?
Exactly. Now, what is it that people get back when they recover?
Their lives.
Yeah, they get back themselves.
Right.
And you asked for some good news. Here's the good news. If what they get back is themselves, it means that the true authentic selves was never destroyed. We lost contact with it as a result of trauma. But because it can never be destroyed, we can regain that contact. So that capacity to reconnect to ourselves, to our true selves, to truly recover ourselves, that's with us as long as we're alive and conscious. So I'm totally optimistic about the human capacity for healing. By the way, healing, the word itself, means wholeness, which means that we become whole. All these parts of ourselves that we cut off because of trauma, we can reconnect with our healthy anger, we can reconnect with our love, with our joy, with our sense of meaning and purpose. We can reconnect with our genuine commitment to be in contact with others. All these things are available to us. So trauma doesn't destroy anything. It cuts us off from things that never themselves go away. And recovery is the reclaiming of our whole true selves, available to us always, always, always. And that's the basis of my absolute optimism.
All right, so here's my take on all that, like in a nutshell. Honestly, what stuck with me the most is this whole idea that we're way more than just what we've been through, our struggles, our trauma, whatever labels people, or even we slap on ourselves. That need for connection? I totally get it. Whether it's spiritual, through relationships, or just feeling like part of something bigger, it's so human, you know? And when it comes to addiction, this perspective blew my mind a bit. Like, addiction isn't the actual problem. It's how people cope with pain. Makes so much sense, right? It's like, sure, you can stop the behavior, abstinence, but that's just the start. Real healing, what they called sobriety, is about being present and actually dealing with what's underneath. That's a lot. For parents dealing with kids struggling with addiction, that hit hard. The whole don't try to fix them so you feel better thing? Oof. I can imagine how tough that must be. But the idea of looking at it as a wake-up call for the whole family to heal? That feels powerful. Bottom line, healing's possible, even when it feels impossible. It's about reconnecting with who you really are underneath all the pain and survival stuff. And yeah, it's messy, but it's also kind of hopeful, right? All right, let's find out the final healing recommendation by Dr. GaborMate.
When somebody stands up in front of a group and says, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic, it's a brave step. They're saying, I'm going to stand up in the front of a group of my fellow human beings and acknowledge that I'm engaging in a behavior that's been harmful to myself and to others. I'm going to stand up in front of you despite whatever shame I feel about it, because I want you to know me and I want you to support me. And I'm not going to deny it anymore. But that's a positive step in itself. However, there's a danger in it. And the danger in it is exactly what you just outlined, which is that you completely identify with a certain behavior and say, I'm an addict. No, you're not an addict. That's not who you are. You're a warm-hearted, loving human being who used a certain addiction as a coping mechanism. That's who you are. But you're much more than that behavior. So that whenever somebody identifies themselves that this is what I am, I'm going to say, no, that's not who you are. So if I could possibly outlaw the word addict, I would. What if somebody, every time you use the word addict, instead of addict, you'd have to say, so-and-so, or myself, is or am a human being who suffered so much pain that they use this particular behavior or substance to soothe themselves for a while. What if that's what you had to say every time you wanted to use the word addict? Now you'd have a much more complete picture of a human being. So I agree with you. And don't identify with some behavior that you had to adopt as a coping mechanism, but that doesn't characterize who you really are. There's a danger in that identification. So it's a limitation of who you are and who you ever were. So on the one hand, I see the value in that kind of acknowledgement, but I also see the danger of identifying with that acknowledgement. I could have mentioned more, but they include healthy anger, because a lot of people grew up in circumstances when they weren't allowed to experience healthy anger. And healthy anger is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a boundary defense. If you don't know, like you say you were bullied in school, part of your problem when you were bullied was that you didn't have how to be in touch with your healthy anger. And the bully can always sense that, because the healthy anger is just a boundary defense. It says, no, you're in my space, get out. A lot of kids are socialized out of their healthy anger because of parenting practices that we talked about. So healthy anger is just as, no, really important. It's not the same as rage. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It's a boundary defense. So that's an important A, is the capacity to set boundaries. People who develop autoimmune disease usually have no capacity for healthy anger, or at least their capacity for healthy anger has been suppressed. As the anger that is suppressed turns against them, so does the immune system. That's why there's so much autoimmune disease amongst women, by the way. Because in the society, they're told that the woman's anger is unacceptable. I'm not talking about rage, I'm talking about healthy anger. So that's the first A. Another A is agency, the sense of that we're in charge of our lives, that we're the ones to make the decisions. So that even if I go to a doctor with a health issue, ultimately I'm the one that's going to decide what path is right for me. I'll take the advice respectfully, but it's up to me. And the same thing is true in everyday life. Who's in charge of your life? Who's living your life? Authenticity that you and I have already talked about. That's another one of the A's. So There's various concepts that we adopt them that can help us sleep. I didn't put this into the book, but awareness is an important day of mindful awareness, because so much of our functioning, to speak for myself, but most people I know, is unconscious. So to be aware of our minds and what arises in our minds is just an important dynamic. So there's lots of pathways to healing. I never say that the ones that I outline is the only one. I think the biggest thing is curiosity towards oneself, the willingness to ask questions, the willingness to let go of ideas that no longer serve us, the commitment to be authentic, the willingness to learn from negative experience. Or disease can be a great teacher, addiction can be a great teacher. I mean, let me ask you this. When you consider what you've learned from coping with your addictions and overcoming them, aren't you grateful for the learning that you've been able to acquire? So keeping that mind of curiosity open, I think, is so essential. So my advice is to parents is that there's 3 things you can do with a loved one who's addicted. 2 of them are sane, 1 of them is insane. What I don't believe is in tough love. There's either love or there's tough. But love is not tough, and tough is not love. So there's 3 approaches. And I've had so many parents tell me that they so regret their so-called tough love approaches. But that's the only thing they knew, because that's what the experts told them. So there's 3 approaches, parents, you can take towards a child who's caught in the throes of addiction. 2 of them are sane, as I said, 1 is insane. It's totally sane. First of all, you have to recognize something. The child's addiction is not an isolated phenomenon. The child's addiction is a manifestation of familial trauma. That child is simply the canary in the mine. They're the sensitive one who's manifesting all the suffering and multi-generational trauma in your family. It's nobody's fault. As a parent, I pass my trauma on to my kids. I'm not saying that proudly, but I'm also not saying with full of shame anymore. It's just what happened, because I didn't know any better. I did my best. You did your best. But if we're carrying trauma, our best includes the transmission of trauma to our kids. So that your child's addiction is a manifestation not just of some pathology inside the child, but of a whole family dynamic. So are you willing to look at the whole family? Are you willing to use the child's addiction as a wake-up call for the whole family to engage in examining what happened to all of us here? The child happens to be the sensitive one, but they didn't cause it, it didn't start with them. So a sane approach is to say, I'll come back to this in a moment, but a sane approach is to say, we get it. Right now, your addiction is your attempt to deal with pain in your life, and you seem not to be able to do without it. We get it. We're not going to argue with you. We're not going to try and change you. We wish it was different for you, but we'll love you and accept you no matter what happens for you. And we're going to be there for you. We're not going to put up with being lied to. We're not going to put up with being stolen from, but we're going to love you and we're going to be in your lives. And we're not going to try and change you, because we realize that then change can only come from within yourself. That's a sane approach. Another equally valid approach is to say, sweetheart, we're not going to blame you for your addiction. We know that right now this is what you feel you must do, but it's too painful for us. We can't be around it. We don't know how to handle it. So when you are willing to get some help and so on, please let us know. We'll be there for you. But right now, we just can't handle it. Not because of us, you, because we're not strong enough to handle it. That's honest. You say so lovingly, not with an attempt to manipulate the child, but just that's your truth. That's totally sane. What both approaches have in common is we're not going to try and change you. The third approach is we're going to be in your life and we're going to keep cajoling you and inducing you and threatening you and begging you to change. That's insane making. All you're going to do is get more resistance and you're going to make yourself crazy. So both levels, either be with the person and accept them for who they are, or accept them for who they are, but not be with them if you can't stand it. But whatever you do, don't put pressure on them to change, because whenever there's pressure, there's going to be pushback. Now, interventions. Here's the intervention that I believe in. By the way, in the book, I quote this friend of mine. He's a psychiatrist and he's an American Lakota background. His name is Louis Mel Madrona, and Louis says that in the Lakota tradition, in the Lakota Sioux tradition, when somebody got sick, the community gathered around them and they said, thank you. Your illness manifests some dysfunction in the whole community. You're just showing us some imbalance in our whole community. So your healing is all healing. And that's the kind of intervention I believe in. So the intervention that I believe in is, you got this addiction. Thank you. The pain that you're trying to soothe is not just your pain. It's the pain of the whole multi-generational family. And we're going to try and heal that pain. And we invite you to join us. And if you're not ready to join us, that's okay. We're still going to do the work for ourselves. But we'd love it if you did join us in that work. That kind of intervention I believe in. But not just as words, but as actions. In other words, that the family uses the addiction in one individual as a wake-up call to deal with the multi-generational trauma in the whole family. That's a beautiful intervention. So that's my answer to those parents. And believe me, I know how difficult it is to have adult children who are struggling with issues, addiction or otherwise. For a parent, there's no greater heartache. You have to resist the temptation to try and fix the kid so that you can feel better.
All right, folks, that's a wrap on this conversation, one packed with wisdom, hard truths, and hope. If there's one thing to take away, it's this. No matter where you are or what you've been through, healing is possible. You can reconnect with your true self, and you're not defined by your struggles. It's all about showing up, staying curious, and taking that next step, even if it's small. If this hit home for you, or maybe gave you a new perspective, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. And hey, if you're into deep conversations about growth, healing, and everything in between, make sure to subscribe to Inside Serene so you don't miss what's coming next. Your journey matters. Keep going, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next one.